based on logs or whatever. But you can also just throw those away as well. So.
Hey Aaron, my name is Andy, and we're running a almost standard Rails application. So Nginx, fronting Unicorn that spawns a couple of workers with all kinds of fun cron stuff and joy all around. So I guess the question would be what we're looking at actually switching over to Docker to deploy into production, not just testing it with it.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of reference. There's been a lot of flutter around how do you do Rails in Docker, and none of it is too solid, and none of them actually mention how would you do a production deployment with Docker, with Rails deployment.
Right. There are a lot of there's a lot of contention about that. As Docker, as Docker incorporated, we say run one service per container. So that means if you're running Rails, you run an Nginx container, and then you run a Unicorn container below that runs the web app part. And then you run workers and maybe a message queue or something to run cron jobs in a separate container. Now these can all share storage, so state can be shared amongst them. But the idea there is that you completely separate concerns within your application as well. So you have fewer points of failure, oddly, even though you have more containers. From an application perspective, you've actually caused it to scale at that point. So, from an architectural perspective, I don't know anything about your app, but that's kind of how we suggest doing things. So, having the database separate, et cetera, too. It's the cleanest solution, and it's the easiest to manage in general.
So Unicorn is set up to do all kinds of funny things like preload the Rails environment and spawn off workers, or fork workers sharing memory.
Right.
So in that scenario, you recommend one worker per container, which
it's totally dependent on your application. I can't tell you what to do, but usually workers.
I guess I'm trying to ask if there are any restrictions around 14 processes of the main process you launch.
Not at all. No.
Okay, so okay. If there are any questions, otherwise I can ask like 15 more.
Any other questions? Sorry, you're out of luck.
Damn. I was about to ask about Chef Metal and Docker and what you guys get. Sorry.
Everything I've seen on Docker goes through this basic demo about how to configure a container and spin it up. Once I've got an environment going, how do you monitor and manage it?
It's a good question. So we have in the pipeline, we have some of our own management infrastructure going into it through some libraries that we're writing. One's called libchan and one's called libswarm. And the way that these things work together is that they kind of federate Docker instances across hosts, and they do things like monitoring containers, restarting containers, et cetera. Well, they allow for that, the primitives for that. So that management tools can be written that can, have a standard API and can kind of do the right thing. That's sort of in the future. Now there are some, it depends on what you're doing again, but at DockerCon we had 7 management tools that were open sourced by people like Google and Amazon and Spotify, and a huge list of people. There's a lot of thought going into this, and Google has a great project called Kubernetes, which is meant for managing containers. They're using it internally. They've also invited a bunch of external partners to use it and to contribute to it. It's an open source project. It'll also be using libswarm and libchan pretty soon. So, and there's a lot of work being done in that space. So right now it's kind of up to you to do it manually. So you can use Chef or Puppet or Ansible or whatever to kind of manage start-stop. So people use System D on that as well. And then, monitoring, we, internally at Docker, we use Monit to just restart containers if they fail. But it's very lightweight. So these questions are great but they also reveal something about Docker, and that it's, we're production ready, but it's still a very new and evolving technology. And there's a lot of places for people to plug into the community and help out with these sorts of questions, and provide feedback to us about what you think would be useful. We're, working with lots of people and lots of customers and lots of partners to make sure that whatever we build for the continuation of, past Docker 1.0 is suitable for broad-based scale-out production. And we are an open source company, we're an open source product, and thrive on our community of people, and want you to help. So that's just sort of a plug for the community, but I think that it definitely is very dependent on what you want to be doing right now and how you want it done.
Hello, my name is Alex. Sorry for probably ignorant question. Our environment consists of several processes, and we want to scale it. So I was wondering how you specify the dependency between containers, and is there anything like super container with pluggable sub-containers that you could deploy?
Right. So right now there isn't any primitive in Docker that allows you to say this, like my database needs to be up before my application or something like that. That's coming and will be out before the end of the year, probably in the next quarter. I think it's actually in this quarter's roadmap. The Kubernetes project that I mentioned before does have those primitives baked into it, so it's sort of an external thing, but you can define a set of dependencies amongst containers and how to link them together and things like that. So there's definitely stuff out there to do it, and it will be a part of the core Docker before long.
Any other questions? One question comes.
So it's the Rails guy again.
Hey.
A quick question around workflows. One of the things, we're running on AWS, and one of the scenarios we're trying to kind of work out is, okay, you develop in your sandbox development environment, whatever, you get some CI cycle. Now it's a closed source product, so you don't want to go push it into the public hubs or registries, repositories. Do you run your own? What would a cloud deployment of a Docker solution look like when you're trying to push applications into it?
Right. So Docker Hub itself has a private repository feature that you have to pay for, but it's not very expensive. Very similar to the way GitHub works, So there's that option, and that's the sort of easiest thing to do. If you have to have everything kind of in your own infrastructure, there's an open source registry. It's the same registry we run behind Docker Hub, but it doesn't have any user stuff at all. It's purely an API driven thing. And that works great too. So, you can use that on any machine you want, kind of anywhere you want. From a sort of CI workflow situation, Docker Hub itself has built-in primitives that we can build your images for you and then trigger a CI run based on that being built. Can't really do that with the the open source registry, but you could wrap that around as well. A lot of people use Jenkins for this kind of thing, but there are other, Circle CI is doing a lot of work around that as well. So, and shippable as well. So, you know, there's a lot, there's a lot of options. Again, the basic, you know, thing is that, you know, Docker Hub enables a lot of this directly via webhooks and triggers and stuff. The kind of next step of running your own is a little more challenging, but it's not super hard or anything. The APIs and the source code are all open source, so you know, you could write a little wrapper around the open source registry and use that in your workflows pretty easily.
Anything else? All righty. Thanks very much, Aaron.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Cheers.
Bye.
All yours, Mr. Thanks, Tim. Okay.
Okay. All right. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah. All right, so my name's Dan Giusalfi, and I do work with David's group here and several other folks in the room. We're part of an emerging technology team in IBM, and we've been around for a while and evaluating many different technologies and working with customers in the enterprise and helping them to evaluate those technologies, and sometimes sharing the risk in that evaluation. We like to think of ourselves as like a mini research team inside of IBM. So Docker becomes just yet another technology that we've been looking at. So what I'd like to do, Aaron opened up with a question to raise their hands about who's been using Docker, right? I'd like to find out how many people are actually developing applications with it. I mean, is the one thing just, are you kicking the tires, or actually application projects underway? Okay, all right, that's good. So that kind of gives me a little. So what I'm going to try to do, take a little different spin of this. Aaron gave you like the basics, like what Docker's about, underlying plumbing. What I do is take a tops-down view of what an application development team would be doing with Docker and what we've been doing inside of our team. And there's several different projects I'm going to go over. So take a high-level DevOps kind of perspective of why Docker is a good enabling tool, and give you examples of how we're doing it in those projects. So one more question by raise of hands. How many folks did attend DockerCon? Okay, good. So this just gives me a basis. So if you had attended DockerCon, Gene Kim, one of the presenters there, you can Google him on the web. He spoke about DevOps patterns, specifically the 3 ways. And if you're an application development team, this becomes a very interesting reason for justifying why to use a technology like Docker, right? Aaron talked about containerization, being able to take containers, package everything into these logical blocks that can be distributed to any, back to one of the questions, distributed to any platform, run on any platform, and continually updated. So that allows a very interesting improvement in the whole DevOps experience or DevOps workflow. If you haven't picked up the book, the Phoenix Project, has anybody read it? Okay, please do, right? This will give you a great example from an IT shop, an enterprise shop in the manufacturing arena, living their pain, and why notions like continuous deployment and integration, distributed flexibility of distribution, reducing repeatable work, all these DevOps concepts become very important. And then if you step into Docker, you're like, whoa, the light bulb goes on. Docker's a nice enabling tool in my tool belt to actually achieve some of those DevOps goals that are talked about in the Phoenix project. And the patterns that you'll see here, this is called the first way, second way, and third way, are all talked about in the book. So just a point of interest, it's a quick read. It literally is a real-world experience about a manufacturing company and the pain they go through. and you'll see why some of these DevOps patterns become useful. So we actually, reading that, we've actually seen some of these patterns in our own application projects. I'm going to show you in a moment. I will also mention this. Over the past month, I've been contacted by 2 financial institutions down the street, and both of them asking IBM for what's the insights on what are some of the skills that are going to be defined in the new or the future application development teams. And I pointed them to the same question. Go read this book, because it gives you a nice framework. But then, what tools are out there? And one of my recommendations is Docker is a good example of how to achieve some of these patterns. So, nice reference point for you to read. What you learn about in the Phoenix project is this notion of work in progress, right? So whether you're an application developer or you're an ops guy, there's always work in progress, right? My build kicked off, it failed for some reason. What's the inhibitor, right? There's a bottleneck there. How do I reduce that bottleneck in the future to avoid downtime, to avoid work in progress? So, they talk about this notion of the different bottlenecks that are common across all different development exercises. Then if you get into an enterprise like inside IBM, we additionally have go through legal and other compliance activity just to get code ready, right? Those are additional bottlenecks. How do you, when you're doing your application development, how do you actually address these steps in your build process, in your deployment process, in your packaging, and so forth? So this is not, there's big money here, guys, right? And so when you think about why Docker, I mean, this is a technology discussion, yes, but you have to ask yourselves, why is the interest around Docker so important? And I personally believe it's because it is a true enabler for achieving some of the DevOps patterns for efficiency. So what I'd like to present to you guys today is, tonight is that our team here at IBM, we have a couple examples of actual application development teams going through the pain, right? And we start off with your typical kicking the tires of the technology around Docker, and then how do we actually implement it? And we start off with certain adoption points, and then we grow from there. And I'm going to go through a couple examples. But what I want to point out is, back to the Phoenix project and the patterns, what we've experienced is that every application development team they have these challenges, right? As someone mentioned before, that you're working on Amazon, right? Our teams work on Amazon as well as software, as well as our own internal development Vagrant environments, right? So there's multiple targets for our distributions. We don't want to have to go through, doing different things for each environment. Well, back to containers. If I can package it up in one container and ship it off and deploy it on different target environments, including an on-premise customer environment, well, wow, that's an improvement in my DevOps experience, right? So these are the challenges: distribution neutrality, continuous deployment and integration, and then reduce the repeatable work. One of the things that we're experiencing, I did these charts about a month ago when we were first supposed to meet, and one of our teams, we've already gone in a further step here: continuous integration with, pulling from Git in an automated build and packaging up in a container and deploying it very rapid. And what you'll read about in the Phoenix project is that there's a benefit in reducing, to avoid work in progress, to reduce the size of your work, the size of your check-ins, right? So work in smaller batches, if you wish. And if you work in smaller batches, you can increase the frequency of your change in your builds. Docker allows this to happen because, as Aaron pointed out, you have this stack of cached containers, right, that everything's built on and sharing. Well, if you're just changing one of those base containers, there's only one. You're minimizing the change points, right? And then everything else can be updated. So it's a very powerful workflow. I'm not going to spend much time on this. Aaron pointed out a lot about Docker. I've been watching the Google Trends. You can do this yourself. Go open Google Trends and just put DevOps and Docker and Puppet and Chef and SaltStack and anything else that you may think of interest. And you'll see that it's not just hype, folks. All right, this stuff is. I know Dan's going to talk in a little bit about where it is relative to Red Hat and some of the challenges and security and other things. But all technology goes through a cycle, right? in a hype cycle, but where we are right now, there's clear evidence that there's interest here. So like I mentioned before, we started off kicking the tires like any other, like everybody else in the room. It's of interest. How do I do some typical tutorials or whatever. We started figuring out how we put GitLab up as a Docker container on one of our servers internally, right? We didn't have to just internally one of our lab boxes. Then we started to deploy it on different environments within IBM. SoftLayer, if you're not familiar with SoftLayer, is an IBM infrastructure for the cloud provider. We put it up, we use it up there. In fact, if you want to play around with it, I have some provisioning scripts to actually kick off a Ubuntu image with Docker pre-installed for you. And then, one of the things we did, we took a virtual machine, moved the project from a virtual machine, a Vagrant environment, to a Docker environment up on SoftLayer. So just little basic stuff. And they said, okay, well now how do we actually use it in our projects? So one of the things we did was we started, figuring out how to create automated build processes using Docker. The other thing we did was within a community within IBM is that we created a special interest group. So just kind of like this meetup group internally at IBM, who's using Docker, how are we sharing our lessons learned? So the microcosm of our internal community is just like what's going on outside, right? All right, so here's one example. As I said before, we work with a lot of customers, and sometimes customers have to give us data, drop us data. Well, you can imagine dealing with IBM, there's a lot of legal reasons, getting their data and so forth, and I don't want their data to be available once they just drop it onto a server or whatever. So here's an example where, what if I just create a container, a basic container that you can SSH